By the opening of the 10th century, the Norsemen had conquered all the offshore islands of Scotland. The Orkney Earls married into the Scottish royal house, and by the 11th century, Earl Thorfinn the Mighty ruled territories that included the Caithness Peninsula and an extensive coastal area to its south, which was called Sutherland, or Southland. It extended into Ross Shire, whose country town is called Dingwall, the name the Scandinavians gave their legislative assembly places. It was somewhere near here that Thorfinn defeated his cousin King Duncan and chased him south into Macbeth's realm of Moray, where Duncan was murdered. Early in the 13th century, Sutherland was elected a Scottish earldom and granted to a nobleman of Moray whose family was probably of Flemish origin. Though it had married into the royal house of Moray, a Sutherland clan evolved, with a chief powerful enough to protect the most northerly cathedral on the mainland at Dorlock. Only a very small portion of its medieval structure survives in the 19th century church which stands on the same site, and the earldom itself fared little better. For the 14th and 15th centuries were a period of baronial anarchy in Scotland, with the crown in eclipse under weak kings or during the reigns of minors. The Gordons were invested with vice-regal powers in the north and used these to seize the Sutherland earldom. Adam Gordon called himself Earl of Sutherland without ever obtaining a title from the crown, murdered one of Earl John's sons, and terrorized the Sutherland heirs so that they did not dare to advance their claims. In 1601, Adam Gordon's descendant obtained a remarkable grant from James VI, which provided that the earldom should never be lost to the Gordons to an heiress. This stipulation led to a legal battle for the earldom when the earl died in 1766, leaving only a daughter. The nearest Gordon heir claimed that he was the true earl according to the Charter of 1601, but the House of Lords, sitting as Supreme Court of Appeal, was shown that there had been an heir male in 1515 when Adam Gordon usurped the earldom, and his Sutherland descendant was there to inquire how many centuries were required to legalize Gordon crimes. Their lordships responded by bestowing the earldom on the late earl's daughter, who carried it to her husband, a member of the fabulously wealthy English family of Levison Gower, who was created the first Duke of Sutherland. Meanwhile, the Sutherlands of Force continued to represent the disinherited line of the old Sutherland chiefs. They descend in the direct male line from Kenneth, second son of the 6th Earl. In 1604, John Miller was born in Cheshire, England. The same year, 500 people died of the plague in Nantwich. It was also the year after James I had been made King of England, Ireland, and Scotland combined. John became a reverend, married Lydia Combs, and made the pilgrimage to New England in 1634. He died in Groton, Massachusetts in 1663. Mary Igloo Miller, whose mother died giving birth, left money in her will to provide passage from Ireland to the United States for 3 of her brother's children. She died in 1830. It is unknown whether the kids ever made it to the United States, but it does tell about the strength of family bonds of the American immigrants. Mary's husband was John Miller, the grandson of the Reverend John Miller. In the year 1677, Thomas Pearson from England settled in a cave on the west bank of the Delaware River, which is now underneath the city of Philadelphia. He was a blacksmith by trade, and it is said wielded the first smith's hammer in Pennsylvania. Among the first work he did was to make small axes for his Indian neighbors. The Indian name for him was Tom or Tommy, and in their language any tool used for cutting was called a hawk. Hence the supposed combination of Tommy and hawk for the origin of the word tomahawk. Thomas Massey came to Pennsylvania with the Quakers as an indentured servant in 1683. But by 1708, when he died, he had acquired 800 acres of prime property in Pennsylvania. Among his companions on the ketch Endeavor that brought him to America were Robert Taylor, his wife Mary Hayes, and their daughter Phoebe. She and her parents were definitely Quakers, but it is unclear if Thomas was. Thomas would end up marrying Phoebe, but any religious status Thomas and Phoebe possessed didn't get passed on, as their grandsons were all ultimately kicked out of the church. Thomas did serve as the local constable at one point, and the Massey House still stands today as a historical building and museum just outside Philadelphia in Broomall, Pennsylvania. Born on the Isle of Shetland in 1770, Gilbert Sutherland became a crack-shot whale harpooner. He unfortunately died as he had lived and was buried at sea from the very schooner he had called home while in the English Channel. Irish-American James Starr and his German-American wife, Sarah Kinsler, were unfortunately suspected to be Tory loyalists. They were both born in the colonies, Pennsylvania to be exact, the decade before the Revolutionary War, but ended up in Canada after the war. To add some historical propaganda, consensus among historians is that about 20% of the loyalists, that's Tories, relocated after the war to other parts of the British Empire, which included Canada. Interestingly, their son, James, and his wife, Elizabeth Palmer, made it back to the United States in 1854. Alone, Ellen Nicholson came to the United States on the SS Washington and found work at a boarding house in Boston. John Sutherland had followed in his family tradition of being a whaler and eventually made first mate. His girlfriend Ellen, who had sought passage to the United States without him, he followed her on a later ship that was wrecked in a storm off the coast of Maine. He managed to swim ashore and made it to Boston, where he ultimately found Ellen. In 1859, they were married while waiting for the wagon train to leave Nebraska. They headed west on the Mormon Trail. Along their way, their wagon tipped over in a river, but all were rescued. They made it to Salt Lake City and stayed with Brigham Young for a time. John would become a prominent veteran of the Indian Wars, and they eventually settled as farmers in Big Cottonwood, Utah. Mildred Granny Delmore was born in Ely, Nevada in 1910. At one time, James Delmore, her father, owned a Dodge dealership, and Granny would tell stories of helping around the shop. She had been proud when described delivering Dodge trucks to customers, and they were amazed they were delivered by a woman. This was during the 1920s. She was always very active, including working with gemstones and mineral clubs. The first king of Tara was Conn of the 100 Battles, a huge and fierce warrior, red-haired with mighty limbs, headlong and impetuous, a man blazing with ceaseless energy, who seldom or never was out of his battle harness. Of him the bards sang, "His march was the rush of a spring tide, and his journeying the evacuation of territories, and the whole earth was filled with his glory." But in his fiery soul there were springs, too, of sweet affection. Once he sent his foster brothers on an embassy. They were slain by the king whom he'd sent them. It was night when the tidings of the slaughter were brought to Conn. He sat down, and in his wrath and grief, without uttering one word, chewed down the ashen haft of his great blade. Such was Conn of the 100 Battles, who exalted Tara over all cities, and from whose loins sprang innumerable kings powerful and famous. His name survives in the name of one of our provinces, Connaught or Connacht, meaning children of Conn. and according to legend, Loch Conn was created when Finn McCool, Conn's grandson, was hunting with his hounds, Conn and Cullen. They came across a wild boar. Finn and the hounds attempted to chase it. However, as the boar ran, water poured from its feet. The hounds ran ahead of Finn, and eventually Conn was ahead of Cullen. Conn chased the boar for days until a lake appeared. The boar swam back to land, but Conn was drowned. This happened again in the south to Cullen. Loch Conn, whose name shall never tell of peace. Who is there that knows not the work of the headstrong, harmful beast that made it a pillage and a prey? From the isles of the chieftain Maud, baying with jaws agape, the hound pack towards its destruction bore its impetuous course. The pack of Maud unfaltering, which the beast overcame round Turb's tower, tracked the mighty swine through every impenetrable thicket. It fled before them into this lake. It brought distress upon this tower. The dogs were drowned beneath this homestead by the swine in countless numbers. When it had settled its battles, it went to an island of the lake and took it as a pleasant domain. The soil was its perpetual domicile. From the length of that pursuit, when their doom came upon the hunters, and they met their untimely fate, the lake derives its name. With such a fine and noble heritage set forth by Conn of the 100 Battles, it was a sure bet that marrying a Conn would be an honor. So when Evelyn and Sutherland met Ray Vernon Conn... Wait! Ray Vernon Conn? Oh well, what can we say? Good girl meets bad boy and they fall in love and get married. I mean, the guy hung out with a dude named Dirty Lyman, for crying out loud. Look at his resume. Cotton picker, migrant farm laborer, donut maker. Oh yeah, he had success written all over him.